Welcome to episode 21 of the Woodwind Doubling channel. Today we're going to talk about instrument stands for small instruments. Now, why separate out small instruments as opposed to the large instruments? Well, obviously when a lot of us start doubling, we're playing the saxophone, we get a saxophone stand, we discover it'll take a peg or two, we can put pegs on there, and then all of a sudden we have one stand that's got our saxophone and let's say our flute and our clarinet. Now, while that can be very convenient and simple to pack up, it's not always the most effective in terms of use of space or instrument gymnastics in the pit. What do I mean by gymnastics? Well, if you've ever had to do a maneuver where you drop your saxophone in your lap and then grab a flute or piccolo and play that while you're hanging that, having them on the same stand sometimes is not the best use of space. And with some stands, because they can be a little crowded in terms of their spacing, you could inadvertently strike one of your smaller instruments, which are usually the delicate ones, with your saxophone as you pull it across for a fast change. So not always a good setup. I've also seen a lot of people use individual stands for every single instrument. Now, there are some cases where that can be very handy. If you are like me, flying a lot, and you have to pack the smallest possible stands, oftentimes that means in-bell stands that will fold up easily, but that means that you have an individual stand for every instrument. Now, that means yes, you can put every instrument where you want it, but it's not always the best use of space, not always the best way to group them, and you end up with lots of little feet spread all over the place. It can get a bit messy and unwieldy. It can get in the way and be a trip hazard, frankly. So, what do I do about that then? Well, years ago, I found a friend who was an oboist who was making some really nice hardwood stands, and a lot of the oboists were gravitating towards them because he actually made pegs that fit oboe and English horn especially. Now, ironically, I ended up buying his stands for clarinets and flutes and never did buy the oboe and English horn pegs for the stands, but I'll get to how I've dealt with those things. First up, I'll show you the basic stand that I have. Now, these stands are made from maple. So that's a cut maple base, and you can see that there's leather inserts there to pad the bottoms of the instruments. And on this particular one, I've got this flute peg, which is actually very nicely tapered. Flute goes on very easily. And the clarinet peg, again, beautiful fit for those particular instruments. Now, I just finished a run of chorus line, and I was using this for my flute and clarinet all the way through the run of the show. Now, this being a modular system, I can reconfigure it for different uses. Let's say, for example, I'm doing an orchestral clarinet gig. Well, I could quite easily replace this peg with another clarinet peg, and all of a sudden I've got a stand for my B-flat and A clarinets. Or, as happened more usually for me, you can do this. Voila! Double stand for B-flat clarinet and E-flat clarinet. Notice it's got a smaller peg for the E-flat clarinet, and it's also got a riser. Now, this is brilliant in my mind. This means that you don't have to lean over to get your small instrument. It could be confusing if you accidentally pick up your instruments thinking they're the same height and therefore the same one. But if you're consistent about putting one or the other on the sides, you should be all right in that way. But not having to bend over to get a small instrument and possibly lose sight of the conductor, lose the bar count as you go, very, very handy thing. You can, of course, detach this. This peg is separate from the riser that it comes on, so that can be used in different ways as well. Conceivably, I suppose, I've never tried it, but you could put the B-flat clarinet peg on the riser if you needed that to be higher for a particular reason, just an easier reach. So there's the second way that I've used that stand. I also have a stand that he made specifically for flutes. Now, flute peg goes in with a nice little leather spot at the bottom to pad it. The second one doesn't have padding because it takes this rather longer column for the piccolo. Piccolo peg at the top with its usual little bit of leather padding and a much larger riser on it. Again, that means that you can have the flute and the piccolo at about similar heights. Very, very convenient. Now, I've also found an additional use for this. I've been able to secure other instruments by using little clamping pegs that attach to this. Now, usually we're talking about something like a recorder. Something like this. Like this. This is a little Clampon Peg available from K&M. Now, it's made for mounting piccolos or penny whistles or recorders directly onto a music stand, and I've indeed used it for that. But as you can see in this case, I could have my C flute, my piccolo, and a penny whistle or recorder mounted very, very close by. Very handy way of doing that. It's another configuration I can use with this stand as well. Two pegs similar height, but one's a lot thicker. It's the Alto Flute Peg. Again, very convenient. Now, not an ideal use on this particular stand because it's not padded there, but I have used this quite successfully when I've had to play flute, piccolo, clarinet, and alto flute by putting my flute and piccolo on this base, taking the alto flute peg and putting it beside the clarinet peg on another stand. With two of those bases, I have 4 horns contained within 2 stands. The space requirement is minimal. They're very, very steady. And because of the color of the stands, I actually have an easier time finding them if it's a particularly dark pit. So there's very handy uses. I can configure them in a number of ways. Nicely made stands. I don't know if he's still making them or not. I'm not even going to give out his name because I know what the internet's like and you'll search him and find him and pester him. But look at this. It's fairly straight ahead kind of thing to do if you've got some reasonable woodworking skills. These are standard 1/4 by 20 threads on the bottom of the pegs. So you could actually take it on as a DIY project. Now, of course, since I play oboe and English horn as well, I need stands for those. These bases, being a modular system, are ideal for that, but I didn't buy the oboe and English horn pegs at the time I had the chance. My loss. However, I did find a really handy substitute. Since I've been playing so long, I've got all sorts of gear around, all sorts of pegs, stands, things like that. One of the stands that I have is a sax rack stand for alto saxophone, and it came with 2 small instrument pegs. Now, they're actually made by Beechler in California, and they're a molded rubber type of peg, again with the standard 1/4 by 20 thread. Now, one of them is meant to be a flute peg, and the other one's meant to be a clarinet peg. Flute peg, clarinet peg. The convenient thing is that these are ideally sized for oboe and English horn. The oboe goes very nicely on the clarinet peg, and the English horn, because of the shape of the bell, fits very nicely over what was intended to be a flute peg. So right there, I've got oboe and English horn on one stand. Now, if I'm playing a show, playing the usual reed 3 combination of oboe, English horn, clarinet, and tenor saxophone, I'll put my clarinet on the outside of my tenor saxophone stand and put the oboe and English horn on this stand just to my left, and then I'm all set to go. Now, if I was having to play something like the Crazy Book on West Side Story, where you've got tenor, baritone, bass clarinet, B-flat clarinet, flute, pick, oboe, and English horn, well, basically I'm going to be putting pretty much everything into use. I would put the flute and pick on the stands I showed you before. I put the oboe and English horn here. My bass clarinet stand actually has a space for a clarinet peg on it. I would probably try that to see if I could combine those, just because pit real estate could be really at a premium for a show like that. But again, this being modular, you can pretty much put whatever you want, wherever you want. I've done shows where I didn't have to play English horn as well, so I could just put a clarinet or a flute on there, depending on what other doubles I was playing. I've even taken just one lonely little peg on this and used it on a show where I was just playing oboe. It does happen, folks. Once in a while, I only play one instrument on a gig. Now, what about other easily affordable and also easily locatable sources for small instrument stands? Well, I've been a fan of the Hercules stands for years. They're cost-effective, they're pretty darn durable, and they seem to have come up with a bunch of smart configurations. One of them would be this little beast. It is a triple peg bass. It actually comes with all 3 pegs here. Now, they tend to supply a peg that's useful for either flute or clarinet. Flute would just fit down to there, clarinet goes right over the bell mount. So this is ideally situated for using with flute, a clarinet, and a piccolo. Now, my only issue is, of course, that the piccolo sits rather low, so you've got to bend over for it. If you don't mind dealing with this, great stand for that. One day I'd actually like to see if I can get somebody to make me an extension for this peg to raise it up higher. Only problem is, Hercules doesn't use the same thread size as everybody else. It's not a 1/4 inch by 20 thread. So the thread sizes being different, I mean, it makes for a stronger fitting, but it does mean it's a little less convenient in terms of using different pegs. Now, Hercules also makes another handy stand, and that's this. This is actually marketed as an alto flute stand, and it does that quite well. It's also marketed with 2 slots on it, so you could put your C flute and also your piccolo pegs on there, and have all three of those together. There are several shows that will come up that you're just playing mostly flutes, and certainly those three all the time. Very handy. The reason I actually bought this, because I already had an alto flute peg, is I was looking for something to put a bass flute on for a gig. And this worked really well. Because of the height of the peg, it does unscrew from here. I wouldn't use it in combination with other stands because of the weight factor. You want that centered with a large flute, but it does work really well for bass flute as well. So on those crazy gigs that I've had where I've had to play piccolo and flute and bass flute, I've used this one as well. Very handy, and again, like all of the other Hercules stands, the base folds up, peg comes out, goes very easily in whatever carrying bags I'm using for the gig. Now there's one other thing that I think pretty much all woodwind players should have, but it's also handy as part of your strategies in terms of instrument stands, and that's a stand desk. Now this was a very inexpensive desk. It's actually, I believe it's the Apex brand that Long & McQuade sell. You can probably find this under a few different names in a few different places. I've taken a bit of shelf liner or drawer liner and just padded it because you don't want the noise of the metal shelf. It clamps onto the microphone stand and then secures to it. Now, if you're playing double reeds, you know the importance of having a soaker and having your tools there to adjust your reeds as you go. This is ideal for that. It's also ideal if you're playing penny whistles or if you need a quick place to drop a piccolo. I've certainly used that a lot in shows. I had a show that had, I think it was 12 instruments total, and it included several penny whistles. So I actually lined up the penny whistles in the tray in order of size and marked them all clearly so I wouldn't pick up the wrong key at the wrong time. And I was able to access all of those quite easily without having a crazy assortment of pegs around me. Very good strategy. I think every woodwind player needs a shelf like this. You can put your pencils there, put extra reeds there. Geez, drop your phone or your reading material in between cues, something like that. But a really handy thing and not very expensive and easy to total. So there you have it, my roundup on small instrument stands. Sometime soon we'll do one on large instrument stands. It's going to take a bit more moving around, and I'll show you some sample setups and configurations that work in ways, or at least that have worked for me in the past on shows. Thanks again for watching the Woodwind Doubling channel. My name is Merlin Williams. Please leave comments and questions below. Have a look below for any references to manufacturers or suppliers of products. And we'll see you next time. Oh, and please subscribe. We're building the subscriber base and getting lots more views. And it's really nice to get that kind of feedback. It makes me want to do even more episodes and share the things that I know with you guys. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.